Well, good morning and welcome to the inaugural IFHE monthly webinar. We will get started in just a moment. Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for joining. My name is Troy Savage, and I have the distinct honor of hosting these monthly IFHE webinars. We're excited to get kicked off with getting ahead of the curve, managing refrigerants for compliance and operational savings in healthcare facilities. Uh, on this webinar, you have the ability to translate the captions into various languages. To do so, you'll potentially click on the More button on your screen, then click on Show Captions, click on My Caption Language, and then you can change that caption language to whichever language works for you. Also, during the presentation, feel free to type in questions. And certainly after the presentation, as time permits, there'll be a question and answer session. To use the question and answer feature, once again, if necessary, you'll click the more ellipsis. For most of you, you will not need to do that, and you'll simply just click on the Q&A button. As you know, this session is hosted by the International Federation of Healthcare Engineering, a nonprofit NGO established in 1970 to enable national engineering professional organizations to join in a worldwide federation. The IFHE promotes, compares, and offers, promotes, develops, and disseminates hospital engineering technology, compares international experience, and offers collaboration with other international organizations. And I'm pleased for this inaugural webinar to introduce Walt Vernon, who is the acting president and the president-elect of the IFHE, to share a few words. Walt?
Thank you, Troy. Yeah, the IFHE is an association of national engineering, healthcare engineering associations from around the world. And we are collectively the people who plan, design, construct, and operate health facilities. There are about 30,000 of us, we think, around the world, as best we can count. And we're always looking for new members, so come and join us. This webinar series is a new effort by IFHE to try to take advantage of the fact that we have these new tools and we want to bring our community together and provide them with better access to information. So we're really excited about it. We are going to continue this on the second Tuesday and the second Wednesday of every month. Those dates were carefully picked because they, according to artificial intelligence, because I don't have enough, they conflict with the fewest possible national holidays from around the world. So hopefully you'll find time to join us. And we are always looking for the best speakers in the world. And so we've started off with the very best. But if folks have other thoughts about good topics and good things to do, let us know and we will include those people. I also want to talk about sponsorship. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner of all of our backgrounds that this webinar series is being hosted by Mazzetti. Mazzetti is our current sponsor. Mazzetti is an international engineering firm with offices in Rwanda, India, the US, and soon to be Japan, and we work all over the world. So thank you to Mazzetti for being our current sponsor, and we would love to welcome others to the table as well. So be in touch if you're interested. The last thing that I will note is that these webinars are all free, and we are going to post them to our website, a recording afterwards, so that anybody can access them. And so, I remember my teachers in school used to say, if you have a question, ask it, because probably if you have the question, 10 other people have the same question. But because we're a global audience, if you have a question, probably 10 million other people have the same question. So ask it so that the recordings will be richer for that. All right, and with that, I want to thank the folks from Reef who were brave enough to be our first webinar speakers. I think this is an incredibly important topic. I first bumped into them in a meeting in California a few months ago, and my eyes were completely opened because I hadn't known anything about this topic. And as a climate sort of warrior, this was embarrassing to me, and I'm really glad to learn and become affiliated with this amazing organization. Troy?
Great. Thank you all. So it's now my distinct honor to present our panelists from Reef. So first, Alicia Khan is the Executive Director at the Refrigerant Emissions Elimination Forum, Reef, a nonprofit located in the US. So Reef supports building owners and operators in managing their total cost of ownership and GHG impact through refrigerant management, and is a leading voice in transforming the market towards zero climate impact from refrigerants. More about Alicia. Alicia has spent almost 30 years on international solutions to climate issues, primarily related to building and energy use. In the US, she supported the design and rollout of early energy efficiency programs, including Energy Star, integrated commissioning into state programs, and led advocacy on codes and standards. Alicia has a master's in architecture from the University of Illinois. Next, I'll introduce Zoe Dawson. Zoe's a seasoned sustainability leader with over 2 decades of experience advancing energy efficiency, decarbonization, and refrigerant management initiatives. Zoe serves as the president of Reef's board and is the technical sustainability program leader at IFHE, where she supports industrial, institutional, and commercial clients to achieve their sustainability goals through strategic refrigerant asset management, planning, and implementation. Prior to IFHE, Zoe spent over a decade at VEIC, where she played a key role in leading statewide energy efficiency programs and utility-led research and development pilots focused on optimizing energy use, reducing energy burdens for low-income customers, and advancing emerging technologies. Next, Will Casey. Will is a lead analyst in data and technical sustainability service at IFHE, with over a decade of experience in quantitative emissions modeling, measurement and verification, and asset level optimization for HVAC and refrigeration systems. His work focuses on developing statistically robust analytical frameworks to quantify direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions, with particular expertise in refrigerant inventory modeling, leakage rate development, uncertainty analysis, and scenario-based forecasting to support robust investment decisions. Will has led portfolio-scale data validation, benchmarking, and M&V efforts for US and global commercial portfolio owners, and supported refrigeration and HVAC system design projects incorporating natural refrigerants across more than 50 projects. His passion is really in designing and deploying advanced dashboards and decision support tools that translate complex data sets into defensible, actionable insights. So the next voices you'll hear will be that of our panelists. I'll turn it over to you, Alicia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Troy, and thank you, Walt. And thanks also to IFHE and the Mazzetti team. It's very exciting to help kick off this webinar series. So we're really happy to all be here today. Next slide. And the following slide, please. So healthcare operations, really a unique context to discuss refrigerants in. Not only are the buildings that you run very important, they're often large, they require a lot of heating and cooling. Even if you're in a small building or in a place where you don't have air conditioning, you likely have other use for refrigerants. So in addition to that, the work that takes place inside the buildings is also very relevant because providing effective heating and cooling can be a critical part of healthcare and treating heat distress. And there's more and more research on that every day. There's also increased pressure on the healthcare system worldwide, resulting from storms, flooding, and compromised water quality, from wildfires and poor air quality, droughts, and other major weather events. So refrigerants are really important to discuss because of the scale of the problem that they represent for global warming and for healthcare. There's also significant risk in ignoring refrigerants, risk that relates to the cost and management of healthcare facilities. And finally, there is a similarly sized opportunity to take action. As building engineers, you are really on the front lines of refrigerant decision making. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk about today. Next slide. And I'm going to provide some context and background to refrigerants before turning it over to Zoe and Will to dive more into the some of the technical details. So we can start by acknowledging that cooling buildings has always been very challenging, but really the pressing issues with cooling today are directly linked to an increasingly hot planet. And in the past several years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number and duration of extreme heat events. So on this slide, you'll see some examples of extreme heat just in this past year in 2025. Next slide. So this type of extreme heat alongside necessary economic development around the world is driving the need to cool buildings to new parts of the world. And as temperatures rise and stay high for longer periods of time, it's also getting more difficult to cool effectively. You can see on the left in that chart how the global air conditioning stock is predicted to accelerate up toward year 2050. This represents roughly 3 billion additional air conditioners that are expected to be installed around the world. And thankfully, markets are really leaning toward more efficiency, and we see the installation of heat pumps increasing. And on the right, you can see the numbers of how heat pumps are expected to accelerate over the current decade toward 2030. So along with electrification and renewable energy, heat pumps are really going to help in reducing fossil fuel impact on climate change from cooling. However, while efficiency has advanced and is widely understood among building operators and engineers, as well as the public, we are really not seeing a similar level of attention to reducing the climate impact of refrigerants, which means that unfortunately we're in a place where accelerated cooling means that we're also facing a global challenge to take a more comprehensive view of decarbonization. Next slide, please. So air conditioning and now heat pumps impact global warming from the fluorinated gases used for cooling everything from people in their homes to food in grocery stores to pharmaceuticals in a hospital and healthcare facilities to materials in industrial plants. And this is especially concerning when we understand that many fluorinated gases are thousands of times more powerful in impacting global warming than carbon dioxide. They are part of a group of gases called superpollutants. Next slide, please. The global warming potential, or GWP, of refrigerants is calculated to show how effective a greenhouse gas is in trapping heat in the atmosphere. It uses carbon dioxide as a baseline of 1, and you can see that represented here on the slide as R744 gas by the small green dot at the bottom there. You can also see that R410, which is the world's most common refrigerant, is over 2,000 times as potent for global warming as carbon dioxide. So if refrigerants stayed within the systems and equipment that they're made to operate, we wouldn't have such a huge impact on the planet. But of course, as I'm sure you know, gases leak out. They leak when systems are installed, while they're operating, and also when they're being retired and disposed of. Next slide. So let's take a quick look at kind of how we got to this point and where we are headed. So natural refrigerants, you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide, refers to naturally occurring substances like propane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. And these were the first gases used in cooling equipment. And these are also referred to as A3s. And over time, refrigerants evolved to enable more efficiency and improved temperature control and led to the use of synthetic refrigerants. But early fluorinated gases, both the CFCs and HCFCs, were found to be driving the depletion of the atmospheric ozone layer. So once those were banned, HFCs became the standard. And in the 1990s, We saw these as a substitute for the HCFCs and CFCs, and they're really the majority of what we find in today's equipment. These are now being phased out due to the realization of their high impact on global warming, like I showed on the previous slide. You'll also see HMOs in the graphic, which are blends, and these offer a lower GWP alternative, but it's important to mention that these are recognized as PFAS and are expected to be more widely addressed and phased out in the coming years. So the market has had to transition several times to fix problems created by new refrigerants, and now we're sort of headed back full circle toward naturals. This time, of course, new technology has made these substances much more efficient and effective at cooling. There's still a lot of work to do in aligning safety protocols and standards across markets to enable their use, but naturals have a GWP at or close to CO2, so they provide a much improved solution. I want to mention two additional things on this slide. It's important to note that a GWP equal to CO2 is still a problem. We still need to address CO2 and its impact. So life cycle refrigerant management, managing leaks and disposal of refrigerant is still really important. It's important now to prevent refrigerants escaping into the atmosphere, and it's still going to be important in the future, even if we're using naturals. It's also worth mentioning that solid state technology, which could be a whole different webinar, is starting to come on the market, and in the future, it's very likely that those will be able to address some of the need that we have for cooling as well. Next slide, please. So as we've been discussing, the scale of the impact from fluorinated gases is very significant. Countries have taken action, though, through binding international frameworks. The first being the Montreal Protocol to address the depletion of ozone in the atmosphere. And this was amended by the Kigali Amendment to address global warming by phasing down HFCs. And I want to talk a bit more about Kigali because that is really what's influencing the regulation that you're seeing now in countries where you're operating. Kigali schedules HFC phase downs across three groups of countries. The first is the Article 5 non-parties group. This is a term used for a group with mostly developed countries in it. This group is directed to establish a baseline and begin reduction in 2019 and work toward an 85% cut by 2036. And then most developing countries are in Article 5 Group 1, and they were directed to freeze their HFC consumption levels in 2024 and work toward an 80% reduction by 2045. And then lastly, a smaller group of countries with particularly high ambient temperatures are in Article 5 Group 2, and these countries will freeze consumption in 2028 and target an 85% reduction by 2047. So the Kigali Amendment has been ratified by 172 countries. It means there's going to be a lot of changes taking place on a global scale. Next slide, please. So the second reason to talk about refrigerants is risk, and specifically managing risk in the face of the existing or pending refrigerant regulation that I just mentioned. So getting in front of this can be extremely helpful from a capital expenditure planning perspective. You might have facilities that are in different countries with different regulations, and knowing the timetables for new requirements and planning ahead before you face higher prices and shortages can be very strategic. At a high level, regulation is generally going to have some combination of refrigerant tracking and reporting requirements, leak management, and a shift in the supply of high GWP equipment and refrigerant. Some countries are more heavily addressing the opportunity for a circular economy for refrigerants. So this involves refrigerant reuse and reclaim. And this is going to help manage the transition toward new systems. We also see some attention to technician training. So I want to just quickly show you three examples of how the Kigali Amendment is getting translated into enabling legislation. And just keep in mind that This isn't always what it looks like on the ground, but it's still worth understanding what the requirements are. Next slide, please. So the EU is one of the Article 5 non-parties, so they already have regulations in place and actually just revised their F-gas regulation in 2024. And their target is for a total HFC ban by 2050. And just to note that that exceeds the requirements under the Kigali Amendment for an 85% reduction by 2036. So they go beyond that. The F-gas regulation uses a quota system, leak controls, certification schemes, and a digital tracking method to reach this ban. And there are also some member states that have stricter laws, and some even have a PFAS restriction so that HFOs cannot be used as a transition refrigerant. Next slide. In the US, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, or AIM Act, is another example of multifaceted enabling legislation that supports the Kigali Amendment goals. And in the US, we're working toward an 85% reduction by the 2036 Kigali deadline. The AIM Act has three components that really work together to drive market transformation. The first one deals with the supply of high GWP refrigerants by phasing down production of these HFCs. And we saw a significant reduction in 2024. And then the next big step is going to be 30% in 2029, with another step in 2034, and then finally 2036. Alongside the production and supply, we have a technology transition, which is part two of the Act. And this required all new equipment to use lower GWP refrigerants beginning in 2025, so this past year. And finally, we have a third part aimed at existing equipment, which is about refrigerant management. And record keeping requirements started this year on January 1st, and requirements around the use of recycled or reclaimed refrigerant will roll out in 2029. Next slide. So lastly, I think it's helpful to look at India. Even though India is part of the Article 5 Group 2 countries, along with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and other high ambient temperature countries. So of course, India has not yet begun implementing regulation based on the Kigali schedule, but they did ratify the amendment in 2021. They're planning to start phasing down HFCs formally in 2032 to achieve an 85% reduction in 2047. Again, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of market activity. So there's a lot of changes in the market even before this regulation is taking place. It's important also to know that India has a cooling action plan, the IAP, and that was launched in 2019. It promotes refrigerant transition as well as energy efficiency and efforts to reduce cooling demand. So this plan is going to be key to support this upcoming refrigerant legislation and support the market to meet refrigerant requirements, including updating safety standards and training technicians. Next slide, please. So finally, and as a transition over to my fellow speakers, an additional reason to speak about refrigerants, and one that I mentioned while talking about risk, but it's important to put a finer point on it, is opportunity. So end users, building owners, operators, and engineers are all groups that my organization, REEF, was created to work with, because we know that it's critical for you all to be part of transitioning the market to make sure it does so in a way that really works and change happens. So as engineers and operators, you influence so many decisions around purchasing and design, O&M, weighing in on improved air quality and PFAS avoidance. So really on the front lines of decision making when it comes to refrigerants. So I would like to take the rest of the webinar diving into understanding refrigerants specifically in healthcare facilities and talk more about the actions that you can take through facilities management to address refrigerants, and then we'll have some Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over now to Zoe.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. It's really wonderful to be joining everyone. on this webinar today. And yeah, thanks for just providing such a great, really comprehensive global framing around why refrigerants is so important. And I think, how critically across the globe, we do have countries and regions really tackling head on these super pollutants and really helping to provide us with the guidance of how we can effectively transition our use and management of them across our buildings through the various legislations that you just outlined. And I do want to just do another quick plug just to say a huge thanks to Walt Mazzetti and to IFHE as well for elevating the topic of refrigerants. It's certainly near and dear to our hearts. And to ensure that this type of educational series is provided to, the facilities teams, the engineers whose job it is to plan and maintain all of our heating, cooling, and dehumidification systems across our healthcare networks, because this is what keeps us comfortable and safe. And as Alicia, I think, quite rightly put it at the top of this webinar, you guys are on the front lines of this conversation. So having IFHE bring this forward just feels extremely fitting. So what I'm going to try and sort of like run through in the next few minutes is to try and help frame up how and where we can start to address refrigerants in the healthcare sector. So if we jump into the next slide, we can really just start talking a little bit about why refrigerants matter, but also acknowledge why it's hard, because as much as you've just heard the importance of addressing refrigerants, there really isn't an easy button for this. And as Troy mentioned, I spent 20 plus years supporting efficiency programs, and close to 10 of those working actually directly with facilities teams, including those at hospitals looking for ways to help them better manage energy use and associate costs. And I'll share, even when we had meters and building management systems that were tracking energy use and programs specifically set up to help incentivize the right action, it was still hard, because at the end of the day, managing energy use or associated costs or refrigerants isn't a healthcare priority. Saving lives is, and that makes total sense. So I just wanted to, start off by saying, we certainly hear, the challenges, outside of the technology or policy situations that you face. And I wanted to share a few of the anecdotal comments that I've heard over the years that elevate, where you sit and the challenges that you face when you're asked to take on something, again, that isn't seen as central to your job or your hospital's needs. So everything from, if it doesn't reduce risk or save money, it's not going to get funded. In other words, if it's not a core effort, if your system isn't broken, we're not going to get funding to fix it. And as much as, I think many hospitals are applauded being at the cutting edge of medical research, while sustainability certainly sounds good, hospitals want solutions that actually work. And it's very hard if there is little information or education around what's available, appetite for investing what might be considered a bleeding edge solution. All good things to be aware of, but even with all of these facts in front of us, there is a silver lining, because when it comes to managing refrigerants, it is still a critical priority to elevate, not the least to add on to what Alicia's already outlined. But when we look at the emissions in aggregate that just come from the global healthcare sector, you end up being a top emitter. And there was some interesting research that was done by Healthcare Without Harm in 2019 that essentially figured out that if we pulled all the emissions together, again, from across global healthcare sector, you would end up ranking fifth highest in the world as a country. So that's behind China, the United States, India, and Russia, but ahead of countries like Japan and Brazil in their emissions output. So that's just a hard fact to avoid, and certainly something that we need to make sure that we're elevating and seeking to address. Separately, helping to mitigate the climate impact of refrigerants is also just critical for patient health. We've all experienced, and Alicia was alluding to it, the impacts of global warming. And unfortunately, those most at risk from climate change are also typically those most vulnerable. And it's certainly part of healthcare's responsibility to support and ensure positive outcomes, not just for the patients, but for the communities which they serve and are located in. And finally, managing refrigerants across your existing hospital buildings, clinics, and labs, as we've heard, been mentioned several times, is actually one of the most cost-effective approaches to achieving operational savings. So in aggregate, we can see any decarb investment in healthcare can really be seen as creating a net positive gain for all. So let's just jump to the next slide here, and we can just start to pick it a little bit apart further and look at, like, what are we really talking about? How much are we really talking about here? Where are all these refrigerant emissions coming from? And how can we start to identify them so we can start to address them? I find this website, and happy to share if the link doesn't show up when the slides are shared later. This shows the disaggregation of any sector's emission sources and provides a really helpful overview of a hospital's Scope 1 emissions. So those are all the emissions that might come from direct sources like on-site boilers, generators, campus fleet vehicles, and others. And to put it in perspective, refrigerants make up approximately 40% of the process and fugitive gases that are associated with a hospital's Scope 1 emission. That's the purple section of this chart that the healthcare sector emits. And that's significant for many reasons, not the least that it's actually close to double the emissions that come from natural gas combustion in the healthcare sector. So for any of you that do have specific sustainability goals or GHG emission reduction goals, being able to zero in on some of these big contributors using data sources like this can be incredibly helpful to help you understand, and elevate the importance of why we need to take prioritized action around refrigerants specifically. Go to the next slide, please. So now we know how big, a piece of the pie is that we're looking at. How do you really know where to focus? Like, where are all of these fugitive emissions coming from? We often comment, that refrigerants are hiding in plain sight. There was a great UN chart that Alicia shared that showed all of the different potential sources of them, because literally, like, they are everywhere. And this is certainly true for hospitals as well, irrespective of your size. If you're a campus or if you're a small clinic, you will have refrigerants that are used across large assets like chillers and dehumidification systems, your walk-in coolers, and across a multitude of smaller assets. This might be used to support your food services, whether it's ice makers or refrigerators, or indeed special medical equipment like ultra-low temperature freezers. And because refrigerant use is ubiquitous across all of the equipment and the appliances and the systems that we need to operate hospitals effectively, again, it really starts to elevate the importance of categorizing what and where these assets are, what types of refrigerants they're using, so that you, as healthcare facility managers, engineers, designers, and other practitioners can start to ensure that we're effectively managing them, tracking them, and using that information to make the most effective decisions possible. So we can jump into the next slide just to provide a quick profile overview of what this looks like. And I think sometimes visually it's just helpful to illustrate the fact, that there isn't a straight line connection between number of systems you might have at a facility and the amount of refrigerant in use or the climate impact of it, because as shown here in the left bar chart here, as one might expect, chillers represent, a small asset number. But when we start to look about what level or amount comparative of refrigerant they have a large amount of refrigerants in them. The good news is, again, noting just moving to the right here, there are viable technology solutions available today that use natural or ultra-low GWP alternative refrigerants that can support an effective transition when we're looking at this type of asset class. Similarly, when you look at equipment that are more numerous, like your fridges or your ice machines, their refrigerant impact is actually smaller comparative to some of those larger assets. But again, there are already market solutions available that use hydrocarbons like R290 or R600A that make it really easy to transition to a future-proofed investment solution for a healthcare provider themselves. So if we move on to the next slide here, let's talk about some of the opportunities. So As I've been suggesting, ultimately, identifying some of the most effective opportunities at your hospital really just starts with knowing where your refrigerants are and understanding the impact of each of them. So you have more information that you can use to help with those decisions, again, relative to like, how do you manage the refrigerants, that are in your existing systems, fixing those leaks and ensuring that equally you have got information to help support future capital planning with a refrigerant type and a system design in mind. And as I commented at the outset, really just like proactively engaging and thinking about your refrigerants can be one of those most effective approaches that a hospital can take that takes relatively little capital investment as well. So just a few examples here. When we think about managing refrigerants, it can absolutely help create immediate cost savings. If you're preventing refrigerants from leaking, you're lowering the cost of refrigerant replacement cost. For any systems that are operating on phased out refrigerants like R22, this can be a significant expense, and we've already seen and have been able to validate an increase of over 1,000% of the cost of R22 throughout its phase down and phase out period. Equally, let's look at proactive maintenance of refrigerant charge. So what happens when you actually address and fix those leaks and help to support the performance of your equipment? You're helping to reduce operational failure, helping to reduce operational expenditure, and you're also helping to improve the efficiency and performance of that equipment as well. So generally speaking, when we're talking about focusing on maintenance, we're also helping to reduce those capital expenditures as well that equally otherwise might have to occur because you're helping to extend the life of some of your assets. You're helping to reduce downtime. You're helping to potentially offset a necessary replacement. And Alicia sort of like, was mentioning and highlighting at the end some of these regional regulations. So for those of you who are located in regions where regulations are looking to drive specific refrigerant management actions, really getting ahead of the game and ensuring that you and your team have your inventories and your management plans in place to help reduce liability associated with these compliance rules is just a really good first step. And I think, finally back to anyone who oversees more than one facility, as might be with a campus, or a hospital network, all of these strategies are really readily scalable. So they become even higher impact from that perspective as well. So let's jump to the next slide. And I'll say this is my last slide, and then I'm going to let my colleague Will pick it up from here. But what I really want to leave you with and emphasize is that there is a real opportunity for hospitals to act now. The reality is that under the global phase down of HFC refrigerants, those F gases and their availability and cost is going to become increasingly uncertain, and this will impact your ability to operate, service, and maintain your equipment through its expected lifespan, and whether that's a 10, 15, or 40 years. So you really need to focus on building out a strategy now that's going to help ensure that you can do that. You can address your refrigerants like in the most cost-effective and future-proofed manner. So what we've been talking about really is by helping you walk through the necessary steps of creating that inventory, knowing what you already have in place, really focusing on managing those leaks across your existing assets. This is the life cycle refrigerant management, the LRM that Alicia mentioned at the offset. So you can really help to avoid equipment failures, reduce operational costs, and intentionally help to reduce the climate impact of those emissions being released into the atmosphere. And, being really selective when it comes to replacing equipment, like we know that, like equipment fails, and we know and have experienced far too often, like it is very easy to opt for the like for like choices. That as I started to outline, like there are technologies that exist that are already installed, across buildings around the globe that use different refrigerant options that are available that can support you with a more future-proof design solution across your hospitals and your healthcare clinics. And finally, back to all of the folks that are on the front line, we know that facility teams are stretched thin. That was always the number one comment I received. I wish I had more people to help me. But by bringing those teams and those individuals in intentionally now, helping to educate them about what needs to be done, makes it easier for everyone to understand and to help to proactively support these important next steps. So I really encourage you, as Walt said, ask questions, ask lots of questions, like engage us, reach out to Reef, reach out to across its network. We'd love to be able to see how we can help you. And just thanks for your interest in listening. And I guess I'm going to be handing things over to Will now.
Perfect. Thank you, Zoe. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining the webinar. So I'm now going to be talking through the various considerations and measures necessary to manage refrigerant-containing assets and at least attempts to strike that right balance between the various risks and opportunities that have been highlighted so far. So as shown, they range from OPEX to CAPEX, compliance to emissions perspectives. Really a comprehensive strategy wants to consider all of them to provide the desired outcome. With that, we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start by putting something Zoe said on the last slide in a bit more context, and that's that refrigerant-containing assets, particularly those that contain HFCs, are likely to be a challenge throughout their lifetime. So what the chart shows on the left there is the HFC phase down schedule across multiple regions, and this effectively dictates how much HFC refrigerant can be produced in a given region. For example, we've got the EU shown there in red, and it's targeting over an 80% reduction in the production of HFCs over the timeline. Now, what you can see here is dependent on the region, the phase down schedules can vary quite significantly. However, what you can also see, and what we've tried to signify with that typical equipment age box there, is that realistically, any equipment installed today, regardless of the region it's installed in, is hopefully going to be in existence for the large part of that phase down, regardless of the region it's installed in. So these pieces of equipment, anything installed today or relatively recently, is going to rely on a steady supply of the refrigerant throughout their lifetime to service leaks. And ideally, you'd hope that equipment installed today would be able to operate for its full expected lifetime. However, the reality is that many options commonly turned to today are not really compatible with this future of reduced refrigerant supply, where certain refrigerant types will not be as readily available as they are today. As a result, it's highly likely that a good proportion of assets will experience refrigerant supply issues, the cost increase issues that comes with that, and also increased risk of asset downtime and potential asset failure. So in the healthcare setting specifically, one of the last things you want is unnecessary replacement of assets before end of life. This creates disruptions. It will also drive up CapEx through rush or unbalance, and it also tends to increase the OPEX prior to failure as well. So this is really why intelligent asset selection and proactive asset management across asset lifetime is so important to mitigate these risks. And before we move on to the next slide, it's also worth noting that it's not just the HFC phase down that is going to be a driver of these challenges. The regulatory landscape as a whole is constantly evolving around refrigerants, and there are also the sort of more standard day-to-day considerations that you want to take into effect, like the efficiency of the system, the ability to replace it, the downtime just through day-to-day maintenance. All of this needs to be considered. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So what I've shown here are some of the key levers that are available to help mitigate some of the challenges, and we've touched on many of these in the presentation so far, so I won't go through each one of them. Managing refrigerant-containing assets, generally speaking, can be complex, and refrigerant-containing assets the performance of them can vary wildly from system to system, but realistically, the actions required to manage them tend to fall into two broad categories. So firstly, we can reduce the amount of refrigerant leaking from equipment. And secondly, we can replace equipment systems with systems that might minimize regulatory risks or supply issues or operational challenges over their lifetime. In reality, both these approaches need to work in tandem, and there are a number of activities to consider under each of these. So firstly, listed under the reduce category, and this really applies to both reduce and replace. We start with data collection and appraisal. As mentioned before, refrigerant systems can behave very erratically. Some leak frequently, some hardly at all, some perform efficiently on paper, but poorly in practice. Simply put, not all refrigerant systems are created or installed equal, and data is often the only way to help understand where the real issues lie. Because of this variability, a key strategic principle to focus on that we tend to focus on is to focus on the worst performing assets. We frequently find through analysis that a very small proportion of assets can account for a very disproportionate share of OPEX, store disruption issues or emissions, and all the sort of negative consequences that come with that. From there, you can tend to deploy targeted measures such as leak detection on particularly troublesome assets. And we also see strong value in managing clear KPIs. Overall, as a broad statement, we say that reducing refrigerant leakage is not really a one-off exercise. It's an ongoing data-driven process where continuous improvement of the best practices is critical. When it comes to replacing systems, the challenge often is that they're not always future-proof or ideal options to replace them with available today. That makes it essential to properly appraise what options actually exist rather than defaulting to like-for-like replacement. When selecting, it's important to consider the cost of ownership alongside other life cycle metrics being increasingly used to assess. A key focus as well should also be the regulatory risk analysis. This specifically can help avoid double risk that I mentioned, where you install a piece of equipment, you then can't have the refrigerant to service it, and you need to then subsequently replace that piece of equipment far. Often, to prevent this, we find that staggered replacement might be the most pragmatic approach. There might be assets where no ideal solution exists today, so the best strategy might be maintain those systems and focus on replacing another tranche of assets elsewhere, for example. Across all of this, system design, pilots and R&D can also play an important role. The best solution often is not a direct replacement at all. It might involve system redesign to reduce the reliance on these high-risk refrigerants altogether. Finally, for this side, we always recommend bringing these decisions together into a clear asset roadmap. This helps ensure actions are proactive rather than reactive, and again, reduces that risk of unplanned cost and disruption. In summary, there are several levers available to help reduce or replace refrigerant-containing equipment. None are foolproof on their own, but balancing both approaches is possible to achieve the desired outcomes, and that's regardless of your priority, whether it's reducing capex, disruption, or opex, or reducing emissions. Following these key behaviors tends to drive the desired goal that you're looking for. If we can go to the next slide, please. So getting I'll go through this one quickly, but this slide illustrates where the main opportunity and challenges tend to sit when developing a refrigerant asset strategy, maintaining assets. Existing assets or existing sites can present the majority of the challenges, but they're also where the majority of the opportunities lie. So if you want to reduce your OPEX, reduce your emissions, or improve the reliability or the performance of the equipment in your buildings, then you really need to start with what's in place. Existing assets also have the benefit of having data associated with them. So data often give us the ability to identify and prioritize where those opportunities exist. As stated, it also provides a significant challenges to where the risks exist. It's where legacy investments might mean that you don't want to move out of a certain equipment type too soon. And it's also where asset replacement can cause site disruption. So an effective asset strategy needs to balance all of these factors and arrive at an approach that works for each specific organization. And if we go to the next slide, please. So to support this, we recommend an approach and have also developed processes and tools to help create these data-driven strategies, which can be optimized to meet the specific goals of an organization or end user. The intent is effectively to help determine which levers to apply, where and when. The process generally consists of 4 stages. It starts with that data appraisal phase. the options evaluation, where you determine what are my various levers that I can pull, what is the impacts of those going to be, and then you can look into strategy modeling, where you can determine the right and most pragmatic order of levers to pull in effect before helping actually implement them. The visuals at the bottom here show some of various strategies compared to one another, where we've modeled key KPIs associated with different strategies. I won't go full in detail here, but this analysis helps people clearly understand the path they're going down, understand what are the impacts to be, where will my risk come from, where might I need to look for alternative equipment replacement in a given year to mitigate those challenges, etc. And the final slide, please. So yeah, I think this is my final slide here, and really it's back to that data point. So data does remain critical throughout any strategy or day-to-day management, as the asset performance can vary so significantly, and it can also change quickly. You want to ensure there are feedback loops that can inform strategies to inform your decisions as they're ongoing. You want to know, is there new equipment to come to the market? Have my assets actually degraded in performance than to that type of thing? So as part of our process, we always monitor projects as they're implemented, compare real-time results against roadmap estimates, and feed that information back into a strategy and adjust as needed. In reality, the strategies really need to be living, breathing frameworks that evolve as this new data comes in. That's the end of mine. So I think I will pass over to Alicia.
Great, thanks. We can go to the next slide, Lindsay. So before we go to Q&A, and we have a bunch of questions, we just have about 9 minutes, so we'll just take a few of them. But I just want to mention, Walt was talking about REEF at the beginning of the webinar, and we do have a lot of resources on our website. This QR code will take you to our site, but it's reefclimate.org. Also, feel free to send us an email. We do check this email, so we will respond to you if you have any questions, or we can support you in any way with information. Lindsay, I think you can take down the slides. Would appreciate that. Thank you so much. And so Will and Zoe, we just have time for a few questions, but I want to start off with one about leak management, leak detection, and not just for big systems, although that would be a good way to answer it too. What are the technologies available for leak detection on systems, but also what about leaks in like window units and stuff? What if, somebody's in a clinic and they've got a bunch of window units for air conditioning? What should they be worried about with leaks related to that? Whoever wants to start.
I can jump in, or unless Will, you want to jump?
No, I'll leave it to you. I can follow up.
Sure. So I think I'd probably break that question into two different parts there, because the entire topic of leak detection is actually integrated into some of the regulations as well. So when we start talking about leak detection systems for larger systems, there are specific compliance requirements around that, and functionally, refrigerant detection and leak detection systems can help support a number of different things. I would imagine anybody that, anybody in the hospital environment is already very familiar with this, because you have OSHA requirements, and leak detection systems, first and foremost, can provide like a critical safety feature across any of your systems that have refrigerants, because irrespective of the refrigerant type, if they leak en masse, they can create an asphyxiation concern. So that is just something, especially for a hospital with patients that could be immobile, you need to make sure that you have effective leak detection, across any system that has the potential to essentially remove or displace oxygen within a room. But I think when we talk just more practically around how can leak detection systems help to support some of your operational goals, as well as help to support and advance the transition to some alternative refrigerants. I think there's some other key points that we can elevate here. So, I mean, just purely in terms of operational, goals, like it's always nice to think that you work smarter, not harder. And, when you start looking at various different leak detection solutions, especially those automatic leak detection solutions that provide you with immediate insight into the performance of your equipment based on refrigerant charge, that allows you to respond more effectively and timely to address those leaks so that you can, again, reduce the impact on that equipment performance. So whether it's impacting your cooling, as you were just saying, Alicia, with maybe like a larger centralized system, that's certainly something that you would want to make sure that you're managing, or equally, like when you're addressing both system performance, you're also reducing, as Will was talking about, like the back end of that question of like the necessity to actually like recharge that system with additional service gas that becomes an operational cost. So leak detection, it falls into that, safety, cost effectiveness. And then when we talk about transitioning to some of the refrigerants that we've been looking at, we also have to talk about safety in terms of flammability too, because, a lot of the refrigerants that, we are looking at are hydrocarbons, or the A2Ls underneath the current transition, like have a slight flammability classification associated with them. So, one of the biggest mitigation strategies, nobody wants to think that anything will ever leak. And if it does, you want to make sure that you have some type of control strategy in place that will help ensure that that leak, is identified as quickly as possible. And then whether an associated ventilation and or isolation strategy is deployed after it. Those are sort of the critical things that are really important for ALD. And I think, incredibly important when we're looking in the hospital and healthcare setting. I will say, like obviously when we talk about flammability of refrigerants, there's only a very small portion of refrigerants, those hydrocarbons that we're really looking at there. But outside of that, there is always an outsized benefit in terms of cost savings, operational performance. And again, just coming back to that specific OSHA health concern that leak detection equipment brings.
Thanks.
I don't know,
Will, do
Will,
you
if you
want
want
to
to add
add?
anything.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that it's really about sort of in regards to, say, applying leak detection, for example, to a window unit. It's all about assessing what is the upside and what is the downside. And in reality, there's some pretty simple equations that you can perform, and everyone can make their own judgment on that. But in reality, the leak from the window unit isn't going to be as significant as a larger system. It's not going to be responsible for the majority of your emissions. It's probably not going to be responsible for the majority of your costs. So whether or not that benefit sits there, I argue more often than not it doesn't. So it's all about applying the right lever for the right scenario for the right piece of equipment. I'd say that probably isn't one. I think generally speaking, window units tend to be replaced when they leak rather than serviced, for example. Whether or not that's the right behavior, again, is a different question. But in terms of going out there and installing ALD, that's probably not the right fit.
Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and I want to ask a very practical question, so I'll have to have short answers. But I think we mentioned at some point here, engineers and operators and building owners often rely on their vendors heavily to give them information on what system should be replaced if they're replacing a system or designing a new system. And because there's so much transition and people are still learning a lot, how do you suggest that facility operators, for example, work with their vendor and vet them, understand, whether or not they're giving them the best choices or maybe where else they need to look? Sort of what advice would you give to facility managers and others who are talking to vendors about systems so they can really get what they're looking for in terms of reducing the emissions from refrigerants and lower GWP?
I'll just kick off
Yeah.
really quickly. I think, one of the critical things that anybody, in that situation needs to ask is total cost of ownership. If you're looking at selecting, and prioritizing like new system design or equipment purchase, like it's not just that first upfront cost, that, your, OEM vendor partner, might be providing you with. You really need to understand, like to Will's point, what is it going to cost you to functionally own and operate and service that piece of equipment throughout its lifetime? Because if you're ending up making a selection for a piece of equipment that has a 2025 lifespan, but functionally the refrigerant supply is going to make it like uneconomically feasible to service beyond 5 years, then that is not in many ways, like a good decision. And, I think that's where, we really have to put, the onus on us to ask questions and to ask for greater clarification about, what that equipment and that refrigerant choice really means in terms of what your job is going to be, which is managing it for its entirety of its life.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. It's all about considering the full lifetime of that piece of equipment, and can you envisage it operating as they tell you it's going to operate in 10 years when we know what regulations are in place then, for example.
Perfect. Thank you. So back over to Troy. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Alicia, Zoe, and Will, for that amazing presentation. And I'll turn it over to Walt for the final word.
Thank you, Troy. Again, thank you to the REEF team and the Mazzetti team on behalf of IFHE. We will be hosting our next seminar on the second Tuesday and Wednesday of February, the 10th and 11th. This one will also be focused on refrigerants, though from a different perspective. IFHE has entered into a strategic relationship with ASHRAE, and this will be a presentation from ASHRAE experts on work they have done with the World Health Organization to build global guidance for the management of the refrigeration and refrigerants in line with what we've learned here today. So it'll build upon this foundation and hopefully provide useful information for all. So thanks for all. Thank you, Troy. Back to you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.